Well, good afternoon and welcome to the second CAFII webinar of 2023 on mental health issues in the workplace. We held a CAFII webinar on this very topic 1 year ago, and it was extremely well received. So we are very pleased to hold a follow-up webinar today on this vitally important topic. My name is Keith Martin, and I am the Co-Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Financial Institutions in Insurance, or CAFII. On behalf of myself and my co-executive director colleague, Brendan Wicks, and the CAFII Board of Directors, thank you for joining our webinar today. CAFII is a not-for-profit association dedicated to the development of an open and flexible insurance marketplace. Our 15 members include the insurance arms of Canada's major banks and credit unions, along with their insurer partners, which underwrite credit protection insurance and travel insurance. This is another in our series of 2023 webinars with key regulators, policymakers, and other experts and thought leaders in the insurance sector and related societal issues. Today's topic, as you know, that we will be discussing is mental health issues in the workplace. Now, we're very fortunate today to have two expert panelists with us. Paula Allen is the global leader, research and total well-being, and a senior vice president at LifeWorks, which is now part of TELUS Health. Paula's professional focus is on discovering, defining, and communicating industry trends and service developments that align with emerging market needs, and as well on supporting LifeWorks clients with insights and data-driven decision guidance. Paula is a recognized thought leader in all areas of workplace mental health, learning strategies, disability management, and drug plan management. She is a sought-after speaker and presenter by media organizations and major conference organizers for her knowledge and expertise and insights on current issues and the future direction of health, well-being, productivity, and related risk management. Paula holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Toronto in psychological research and neuropsychological testing and clinical intervention. She has more than 20 years of experience relating to workplace research, product development, and operational leadership. Our second panelist today is Nigel Branker, CEO of CAFII member company Securian Canada, formerly Canadian Premier Life Insurance Company. Nigel brings over 25 years of Canadian business experience to Securian Canada. He is an innovative growth leader, a strategic thinker, and a transformative change agent who was appointed CEO of Securian Canada in April 2022. Over the course of his career, Nigel has held senior leadership roles in pension and benefits businesses within Canadian and global firms, and he has spearheaded many successful acquisitions and market launch strategies. A consulting actuary by background, Nigel is a fellow of both the Society of Actuaries and the Canadian Institute of Actuaries. He is also a progressive thought leader and industry author who focuses on emerging issues for organizations, including mental health, the future of work, and improving workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on the CAFII website in the near future. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to our panelists during the Q&A session, please send them to me as the host using the Q&A function of Zoom, and I will pose them on your behalf. Unless you specifically request in your question to be identified as its source, I will pose all questions to our panelists on an anonymous basis. And just before we get the webinar underway, I want to extend a special welcome to a number of VIP guest attendees. In addition to many representatives from our 15 CAFII member companies, we have attendees today as well from allied industry associations such as the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association, or CLHIA, the Travel Health Insurance Association, or THIA, and from insurance and financial services regulators and policymakers from across the country, including the Financial and Consumer Services Commission of New Brunswick, or FCNB, the Canadian Council of Insurance Regulators, or CCIR, the Insurance Councils of Saskatchewan, or ICS, the Alberta Insurance Council, the Government of Alberta, the Alberta Treasury Board and Finance, and finally, the British Columbia Financial Services Authority, or BCFSA. Welcome to you all. Well, let's get started. Paula, I know that you not only monitor, but also commission and conduct research in this area of mental health in the workplace. And perhaps I'd like to start with you to tell us some of the most recent findings and trends that you can share with the audience today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Keith. So the insight that I have actually comes from the TELUS Health Mental Health Index. And just to give you a little bit of a context in terms of what that is, we looked at what was available in the marketplace. We looked at Stats Canada and what we have in terms of service and insurance data, and nothing really quite hit in understanding what was going on with the mental health of the full working population, not just people who use services, but the full population in real time. So we were collecting benchmark information and designing this and validating this instrument between 2017 and 19 and launched in April of 2020. And what I can tell you is that there was a massive impact at the beginning of 2020 because of the pandemic. So change, uncertainty, risk, increased isolation, all the things that the human mind doesn't like happened all at the same time. So we saw a massive decline, but what's really important to understand is that we haven't actually seen that much improvement since. So to give you a sense of what I mean is, in 2019, we had a definition of high risk. And in our definition of high risk, it's people who have something of an emotional or mental or relationship nature that's interfering with their participation in work, in relationships, the quality of their life. So some major barrier. So if somebody has a diagnosis, but they're well controlled and they're doing very well, we didn't consider them high risk, but many people who have diagnoses do, and many people who do not have diagnoses are trending in a negative direction. We've gone from 12% in 2019 to 35% in February of 2023. We've gone from 2% of the working population who have high risk drinking behavior, 15 drinks or more per week. So the level at which you're likely to develop a substance use disorder, and also the level where if it continues for a long period of time, you see changes in your brain. So from 2% in 2019 in the working population to 8% now, a fourfold increase. And we're also looking at about half of us who, just because we've had so much disruption for such a long time and now have new disruptions of an economic and workplace nature, half of us are more sensitive to stress. And we're seeing that play out in anger and cynicism and more conflict and gun violence and a number of different things. So we're still very much in a vulnerable place. You know, it increased in 2020, but we are absolutely not out of the woods now.
That's very disturbing, some of those numbers. Nigel, do you want to jump in and offer your perspective on what Paula's just shared? Nigel, you're on mute right now.
Thank you, Keith. Well, firstly, I'd say it's a pleasure to be on, and it's really serendipitous for me, leading security in Canada and moving from the well-being space. So in my previous role, I actually was a colleague of Paula, and it's interesting to bring that perspective on workplace health, to the insurance side of the business. I'm also thrilled to be sharing the virtual stage with Paula, who is one of the most knowledgeable and articulate experts in the field. So it should be a lot of fun. I can add some serious executive value by saying that when I look at the impact on the workplace, it's not good, right? I think for a lot of the reasons that Paula mentioned, and I think one of the challenges as an employer is that the actual impact is hard to measure because it shows up in disability and lost time off. Whether you look at long or short-term disability, mental health as a primary or secondary presenting issue is the number one driver of lost time in the workplace. If you look at within that sub bucket, workplace stress is one of the top contributors to lost time off. If you look at recovery, one of the top barriers is the workplace. So when we think about the mosaic and the story that Paul is telling, I think we have a hard time measuring it. Disability is one area. Turnover, it shows up in the workplace a lot. And I would say productivity. So, organizationally, and I think as an industry, I think understanding the perspective, but really focusing on that workplace impact is really, kind of the perspective I try to bring. My last point is I would say that if I look at Mental Health Research Canada, they do flag that our space, the financial institution and insurance space, is one of 5 industries where the burnout rate is higher than average. So the average is about 35%. The average in our industry is 39%. So I do think it's something as leaders we need to pay close attention to.
I'll just add
Nigel,
something to,
please go ahead, Paula.
yeah, I'll just add something to Nigel's point. The productivity question, there's a lot of conversation right now about productivity and a lot of angst amongst business leaders with the sense that productivity is lower than it otherwise should be. And I can tell you right now that our data predicted that completely. And when you have any kind of decline in your mental health and well-being, productivity goes with it, particularly the type of productivity that we're looking for right now. So it's not just, putting together widgets. The things that we notice is that lack of innovation, the lack of collaboration and support for your colleagues, customer service issues, all of the things that make a difference between successful businesses today and those who languish. Those are the things that have been impacted the most. We saw massive decline in this when we saw the massive decline in mental health. We saw a lot of masking of what we thought was productivity, which is a lot of just activity and busy work and, not that innovation work when people were putting in more hours. But now business leaders are saying, okay, I need to solve this productivity question. Maybe I need to get people back into the office. Maybe I need to threaten them and get people moving. No, you need to support their mental health and their well-being, because that's the problem. That's the root cause. And again, in our data, when we have shown that when there has been that visible support and active support and consistent support, those people do better in those organizations that provide that support.
Nigel, what are your thoughts on this issue, and specifically about returning to office? It looks like there is in some organizations a bit of tension between employees saying that they prefer to work from home, they higher quality of life, balance of life, and yet some employers are saying culturally we need our employees together so that we can share ideas and have people working as a team. As a CEO, that must be a challenging issue for you to face. How are you dealing with that?
Yeah, great question, Keith. I mean, maybe before getting into it, I can frame, I'll give some background on how I would frame my answer. So one of the themes when you think about workplace mental health, I do think we're in a sort of a glacial paradigm shift, but I do think we need to change our paradigm. There's a quote that's sometimes attributed to Desmond Tutu. I don't know if it's actually his quote, but the quote basically says, at some point you have to start pulling people out of the river and look at why they're falling in. And I think historically, when it comes to mental health, our position as an employer has been that we do really well pulling people out of the river. So if you are struggling with mental health, we offer an EAP, counseling, paramedical limits, drug recovery. So we do a lot to help return to work and to help when things are bad. We haven't historically taken a look into how we contributed, and it's the workplace is one factor. There's socioeconomic and other factors, but we haven't looked at how we contribute to the workplace and workplace stress. So I would say, kind of getting to your question, I view that as I think there's 4 things we control as employers that contribute to the mental health and well-being in a more preventative way for our employees. So number 1, I would say, is workloads. And we start to see a movement around that, around managing workloads, right to disconnect policy in Ontario. So I do think we have to look at workloads because that's one contributor to mental health. The second is the one that you touched on, which I would say is the workplace flexibility. And, on that one, I think it's tough because I'll start with Toronto and then move to Canada. I realize Toronto is not Canada, but firstly, the commutes to the workplace are very long. In Toronto, we have the second highest commute time of any city in the world at 96 minutes. We are 1 minute behind Bogota in Colombia. And when I drive around downtown Toronto, I have full confidence that we will take the #1 spot. So I'm pretty sure Toronto will have the longest commute of any city in the world. For Canadians, the average commute time both ways is 65 minutes. So there's always been this asymmetrical discussion around, as employers, we've historically said, hey, that commuting time is your time, and that's the cost of having a job. But as we move to more remote work arrangements, there's always that niggling question of like, well, how do I know people are home are actually working and actually productive? So I do think that's kind of a symbol of that paradigm shift. So workplace flexibility, I'm certainly more in the camp of more supportive for flexible work arrangements for some of those reasons. I think the other reason we don't talk about, and the other thing we control, is workplace psychological safety and inclusivity. And the data is pretty clear that a lot of women, a lot of people of color are not yet comfortable returning back to the workplace because we haven't addressed the systemic workplace environment issues. And I guess the last pillar is time off, right? So I would frame it as, I mean, that's the framework, and I'll talk more about those 4 points. But specifically, the point you asked about, grappling with workplace productivity, I think it's really dangerous as leaders, and we know this, when we hyper-focus on one KPI. So if I set a sales construct where I commission my salespeople on revenue only, I'm probably going to underwrite a lot of unprofitable work. I will hit those revenue targets, but it may not be profitable revenue. And so I think Paula's point of this is not an easy question. So productivity in the workplace, productivity at home, impact on mental health, turnover in the workplace, I think it's a really challenging construct. In general, I'm in the camp of we're in a war for talent. And yes, productivity matters, but so does engagement, and so does mental health, and so does turnover. So I take maybe a less rigid stance, and I think we take a less rigid stance than some of our competitors.
All right, thank you, Nigel. And I might follow up with you and then Paula on sort of stepping back and asking a sort of fundamental question, which is, there was a time not that long ago where there was a stigma attached with mental health issues, and people were concerned about revealing mental health problems because they were afraid it could damage their career. And so I first of all want to ask you, is that stigma still there? And in particular for you, Nigel, how do you as a CEO try to ensure that people can feel safe revealing that just as we all get sick physically from time to time, we can all get sick mentally in different ways from time to time as well. And I'm going to add to that a question from the audience, which is related to what I've just asked, which is, how do you incorporate mental health concerns and support during and beyond the hiring process? And specifically, how do you remove the stigma around breaks that you might see in a person's resume or in a person's job history for mental health reasons? Nigel, I know that's a bit of a tough question, but I know you're up to it. Please let us know how you handle that as a CEO.
Yeah, I'll do my best. Well, firstly, I would say it's one of those sort of mixed stories. I would say we've made some progress on the fact that we're having a webinar today on mental health, and folks like Paula and Bell with their Bell Let's Talk. Like there's been a lot of energy put into bringing the conversation into the open. So I do feel we've made some progress, but I think there's an awful lot of work to do. So for example, I talked about how traditionally employers, our position is, hey, we make tools available, right? If you need it, that's part of our value prop. There was a recent study, US-based study, but the study basically said that 19% of employees take advantage of the mental health support that's offered in the workplace, even though 65% of the employees struggle with mental health issues. And in fact, 45% of those attribute a loss of productivity of more than 5 hours a week. So to Paula's earlier point, mental health is impacting our workforces, and we don't see the willingness to take advantage of support. And I can only attribute some of that to continued stigma, bias around job security. I also would say we have work to do as leaders. Like there's not a lot of leaders who role model openness about mental health, their own personal experience with mental health, their family's experience with mental health. Like, so we sort of walk the talk sometimes. We don't walk the talk sometimes. We talk about mental health, but we don't have a generation of leaders who are comfortable being vulnerable yet. And I do think that impacts the stigma in the workplace.
Well,
Thank you, Paula.
yeah, I'd agree 100%. And to your question, again, agreeing with Nigel, we definitely have stigma still. Like we have come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. There's no question about that. And there's some interesting ways that it plays out. So first, stigma isn't just a thing that's not nice to do. It's harmful. When people feel stigmatized, they don't seek help. And that is sometimes counterintuitive, because even if the help is confidential, even if the help is going to help people in managing the challenges that they have in their lives, even if those challenges are overwhelming and life-threatening, stigma prevents people from seeking help. That's just the way we're wired. There's too much research to say that's not true. We also know that it adds an extra level of burden and anxiety of being found out. So it actually makes the situation worse. But we still have it because people haven't perceived enough that says that we don't. So an interesting thing that we found is when we're segmenting groups, your youngest employees, those who are new to the workplace, those who arguably grew up in an environment where there was less stigma in society, they perceive that there will be more damaging career consequences if they are open about mental health issues than even the older workers. So they might not have stigma in their own minds, but they are picking up in the workplace that things are not the way they need to be, more so than even older workers. The other thing that is interesting is that in terms of concern about career impact and hesitancy to seek help, senior leaders are the most impacted by the perceptions of stigma. And we saw this, we did some specific research on senior leaders, so basically a level below the CEO. And in public and private sector, across industries, it was the same. The message was people were believing, even if their organization had policies and practices, that the rules were different for them as a leader, that they couldn't show vulnerability. Now, of course, we have examples of champions, which are great, but the underlying culture is still there, that even the leadership actually doesn't believe that the talk is actually the walk, at least with respect to them. And the impact of that is a lot of temporary coping strategies. So, alcohol use, gambling, a number of distractions, acting out behaviors in the workplace, but nothing that sort of, focuses on self-healing. So I think we have a lot to do in terms of just demonstrating the fact that our policies are in action. Most organizations wouldn't really tolerate discrimination of any nature, but just like we still have issues in terms of unconscious bias from, a cultural, ethnicity, racial point of view, we certainly have biases that play out in terms of mental health stigma as well.
And I think maybe a closing point on that topic, I would say I try to, having moved to the employer side and leading an organization, I think you have to always look for ways to help reduce stigma. So certainly by talking about mental health, manager training. One of the things we did last year was a challenging year for us. We were closing an integration, and we gave everyone, we shut the office down for a day towards the Q3 to just give everyone a mental health and wellness day, right? Like unscheduled, to say, hey, we recognize everyone's been working hard. And so even little things like that, I think, send a message that as an employer, your mental health and well-being is important, and we're willing to put some dollars behind it, right?
Well, I'll put a couple of points of research to back up what you say. You know, the things that are actually initiated at the CEO level have way more impact than anything else, than programs or services. So, you know, that day where you're shutting down, if it's actually endorsed by a CEO, that reverberates in terms of the authenticity of the message and the culture of the organization more than anything else. The other piece is, you mentioned manager training, and what we found is not just essentially manager training. Manager training is your starting point, but knowledge overall is the best antidote to stigma. When people understand how the mind works, what we have in terms of human vulnerability and human strengths, you know, who actually gets a mental health challenge, and the fact that there is not any human being that isn't vulnerable. You know, the more we know about mental health, and conversely, the more we know about self-care related to mental health, the more stigma goes down. So investment in that area in workplaces, I think, is an essential component of getting over this barrier that we all have.
All right, thank you both. I think this is a perfect moment to launch our poll question. So the question is as follows: do you know someone within your immediate or extended family or within your circle of friends and acquaintances who has experienced a mental health issue or challenge at some point in their life? So I'm just going to launch that, and we'll just wait a few moments, Paula and Nigel, to see what the response is. All right, most of the attendees at this webinar have now responded, and we have a 95% yes, that I know somebody in my close circle who's experienced a mental health issue. Paula, I guess this speaks to what your research shows, which is this is a real problem, a prevalent problem, and it pretty well affects everyone at some point or another in their lives.
You know, it's very similar to a lot of other health issues, you know, heart disease, cancer, et cetera. There are things that you can do in terms of lifestyle to reduce your risk, but that isn't all that contributes to your risk. You know, there's biological factors, there's genetic factors, there's environmental factors, you know, different traumas that happen, and, you know, little traumas that built up over time. There's a lot of things, you know, it's all incumbent upon us to make sure that we're not creating a higher risk for other people, and that we are managing our own lives in a way that reduces the risk. But that isn't the only driver of mental health. So to blame the victim, or say somebody is weak, or say somebody should have done X, Y, or Z, and conversely, to think that somebody who has a mental health issue is going to forever be in a place where they're not going to be able to contribute positively in society, that is just lack of knowledge. So again, I'm back to, we need a little bit more knowledge in our society.
Well, and I loved your phrase, Paula, about, I didn't love the phrase, but I think it's an appropriate phrase about blaming the victim, right? I mean, I think if I go back 10 years, I mean, we're starting to evolve as employers, but again, historical thinking is that having an issue with mental health, my job as an employer is to offer tools. There's very little acknowledgement, and I would say over the last decade, the role that the workplace has played in contributing to mental health and well-being has, you know, exponentially increased. I think we play again, there's lots of stuff we can't control. You know, if someone has a child with an eating disorder, like, we can be there to support it, right? But the actual workplace environment and the impact on the individual, I think, is often understated.
Without question, there's two sides of this as well. I mean, we have situations right now across the world, you know, in Australia, for example, that there are fines that are being levied against organizations for not appropriately managing psychosocial risk. And people get, you know, very anxious about all of this, but, you know, the bar is quite low. It's really making sure that the employment contract is fulfilled. And that employment contract is, I give you work, you give me money, you know, at its very basic. The employment contract does not include, I give you work and I damage myself in any way, physically and that's covered under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And from a mental and emotional point of view, that's covered under emerging guidelines and legislation. So, the bar is not high, but if you take on the accountability that you should as an employer, as a manager, and optimizing the people that you're working with, then you create a mentally healthy workplace that also creates a more productive workplace. So when people are at their best, there's two sides. You don't want to cause damage, but you can actually help people be better. When people feel a sense of purpose, they feel valued, they feel a sense of belonging, psychological safety, they're stimulated, because actually we found in our data that just being inspired at work helps your mental well-being. It's not just about managing risk. When you have all of those things happening, you have that innovation, that collaboration, that productivity, that customer service that we all seek as employers. So the business case couldn't be stronger, from reducing liability, reducing cost, and increasingly to just basically having a successful business compared to your competitors. I'm not really understanding.
I don't think, Paula, most employers will. I don't think most employers would debate that. Like, I don't think most employers would say, not me, I'd like a psychologically unhealthy workplace. but I think the work to be done is really rethinking how we impact that. Like every leader has their strengths and their opportunities. And one of the people I study a lot is Jack Welch, and there's things he could have done better, but he was kind of on the right track on a couple of things. Like, one of his favorite models was he would do a little 2x2 grid of performance, high or low, and alignment with values, right? High or low. And if you're a high performer aligned with values, you're a star. And obviously, if you're a low performer not aligned with values, there's probably no place for you in the organization. But the real tricky thing is the other two quadrants, right? And I mean, everyone has a different view on this. I mean, you could probably do a poll and you'd get different answers, Keith. But certainly, I think, our philosophy and my philosophy is we lean a little bit to, if someone has good values and is a low performer, I feel I can invest in coaching to help them. I mean, ultimately, you have to manage your business, but I think that's worth some patience. I think if someone's a good performer with a bad alignment with values, I think we understate the impact on the business, right? So we can talk about psychological safety, but if there's a star salesperson who's generally sexist and racist, that has a profound impact on the workplace, and that has a profound impact on the psychological health and well-being of everyone else. So it's kind of like the earlier discussion of productivity. I mean, if we look at it through one lens, but workplaces are becoming more complex, and looking at that star sales performer hitting their numbers, but not looking at the impact they have on their colleagues, I think is a real challenge for leaders.
Yeah, when you say that, though, it actually makes me think of another issue, which is the short-term gain for the long-term pain, which we're really understanding now from an environmental point of view. There's short-term pain, long-term gain, and vice versa in damaging the environment, but the same thing in terms of damaging your psychological environment. So with that high performer, and the whole idea of workplace health and safety and workplace well-being, there is an emerging conversation that's getting much, much stronger in the ESG world as well. So you have your environment, you have your social, and you have your governance. And in the social area, there's been some strides made and some strides that need to be made in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also in terms of worker well-being and mental health. And the reason why is that it's not only a social issue and an accountability in terms of community responsibility, but there is actual linkage in terms of your business performance. There have been studies that show alignment between organizations that support the well-being of their people and their long-term stock performance. To your point, not letting that one-star performer damage 20 other employees, but rather having a group that's able to move the organization forward.
So I'm going to ask a question now from the audience that I think is quite challenging. And essentially,
you can take that one, Paula.
Oh,
yeah. I think the question is essentially saying these are important principles, but how do you apply them at the individual level? Because everyone's individual circumstance is different. So I'll read the question. Many organizations talk about support, but I'd be curious on some practical examples of walking the talk, recognizing that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. A day off may not work for everyone to reset, or it may only defer the impact, for example. I would suggest there are variables such as religion, ethnicity, family circumstances, or your role within the organization that may require specialized solutions. What are your thoughts on how to go about taking a specific approach at an individual level? So Nigel, I'm going to start with you on that one, and then I'll ask Paula to jump in.
Yeah, well, I'm going to avoid the question. No, I'm kidding. But I think there is a part of the question, and I think I understand where the person is coming from. But as leaders, there is that balancing act between individual and systemic. And I think we have a lot of work to do on the systemic front. So I agree, it's different for every individual, right? But there are some systemic things I can do. So we talked about religion. We're in the month of Ramadan. I mean, we just did an audit of our offices, and we do well in some, but there are some offices we don't have a quiet room or a prayer room. And so will everyone use that prayer room? Does everyone even believe in God? Not the issue. But as an employer, I probably should have a quiet room or a prayer room. So I think before we get to individual, there's a lot of systemic issues we can tackle. I think there's a systemic approach to workload. I think there's a systemic approach to time off. I'm yet to work for an organization that doesn't have at the end of the year large amounts of unused time off. And then we struggle with, why didn't people take it? Those are things we control, right? The psychological safety in the workplace, those are things we control. I agree with you that everyone's different. For example, one study, if you look at something very, very simple, 65% of women would rather work from home. 50% of men would rather work from home. So neither is right or wrong, right? It's not one size fits all. The challenge is in our space, if the majority of leadership are male dominated, how do we ensure those voices are heard and reflected in the policy? Like, how do we empower the policy making? So I'd rather focus on the policy making. I realize it's not one size fits all. And summer is coming, swimsuit season. So I just started with a personal trainer. And as my personal trainer says, it's progress, not perfection. So we have to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nigel. Paula?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex question, and the answer is complex and individual, but I'm going to answer it in a simple way with just the things that are essential. Two things. One is you have to make sure that your managers are trained, and it has to be mandatory and it has to be ongoing. And the reason that I say that is that it says a couple of things. It actually says something to your employers, the employees, even non-managers, that you're investing in this time. But we can talk from here to tomorrow, and all the people on this call could be very well educated on what the definition of a psychologically safe workplace is, and we could write beautiful policies. But if your managers don't know what this is about and how their day-to-day behavior and how the team functioning kind of contributes to that, then you're not going to have it executed in a way in your organization that's meaningful in the experience of employees. Stepping in when somebody is having a challenge and doing so in a way that doesn't actually, make them feel more isolated or anxious or feel pushed out the door, but makes them feel supported. So we've seen the data that when you have that not voluntary, but mandatory, a high quality, workplace focused training of managers, then your managers can start walking the talk, and that actually translates down. The second thing is, we know that well-being is important, but we know that mental health is a risk to business, not just to individuals. We have good models that we've used in terms of safety and getting attention and bringing change in organizations related to workplace health and safety. And one thing that is powerful is when it is on the senior leadership scorecard. So when you have that level of accountability at the top, then you have managers who are equipped to execute on what makes a difference. Then that might not be everything that you do, but if you don't do those things, you're not going to get far.
Hey, Paula, you took the words out of my mouth. I think that last point on accountability is worth double clicking on. I think the question actually speaks to sort of a bigger systemic framework or issue. And it's that, these topics we talk about, mental health in the workplace, psychological safety, diversity, equity, inclusion, every organization is different. But as a general theme, I would say it hasn't yet made its way into a real business priority, right? Because I think if managing cost, cutting expenses is a real business priority, as leaders, we don't really leave that to chance. Like, we don't meet with our teams and say, hey, can everyone do a little better at managing their budget? Like, we actually give very tangible targets by business unit. So, and I think that's it. I think part of this is it's still in the sort of fluffy zone where we leave a lot to interpretive dance. And I think Paula's point is, I think as leaders, we can, I don't know if it's mandate. I don't think it's mandate or enforce policies, but I think we can give clear direction on what we expect from an organization and from leaders, right? Versus leaving it interpretive.
Yes.
I want to just dig in a little bit more deeply on a couple of groups within society at large. So I'd like to start with the impact of the pandemic on women in particular, and in this post-pandemic phase. Some of the new realities and how they're particularly impacting on that segment of society. And I mention this because Nigel cited the statistic that a larger percentage of women prefer to work from home. We had Polera, that is a partner with CAFII on research, present to us not that long ago on some of the trends in society. And one result that I'll share with you and ask you to comment on was not just that a greater percentage of women than men want to work from home, but that 45% of women said that if they were forced to return to the workplace full time, they would quit. And Polera's Leslie Martin, the SVP who presented these results, said that in digging in deeper, it's because women have additional family burdens. And so the cost to them of not having that balance of life from working at home is greater than it would be for men. Any thoughts on that? And if we do see a return to the workplace and fewer women are participating in that, could that have consequences for women in terms of not giving them the same networking and other opportunities to advance in their careers? So is this an ongoing potential barrier that women may face? So let me start with you, Paula, and then I'll ask Nigel to jump in.
Yeah, it's a great question. So starting with the last and then sort of working back up, it's definitely a risk. And some organizations have recognized that risk and have actually put in place tracking mechanisms as early warning signs to that. So if you have an organization where there is diversity in what people can do, you can come into the office hybrid or not, is that actually impacting the diversity in the progression that you have in your organization? So, new Canadians are more likely to live farther from the downtown core. Women are more likely, as you said, to appreciate and need the greater flexibility. But on the other side too, so sort of moving up, this pandemic has really opened up a lot in terms of the cracks that we have in our society. So people who were vulnerable before really felt it worse. So we saw racialized groups, we saw younger workers, we saw females, and we saw parents. Their mental health declined at a faster rate than those who were not in those categories. So a young female parent, particularly vulnerable. And one of the things that helps you become less vulnerable is a sense of control. A sense of control in terms of your life, in terms of your time, in terms of how you do things. And what the work from home situation did, and what hybrid situations can do if they're executed well, is give people that sense of control. So you have a group that was vulnerable. They became more vulnerable because of a lot of factors during the pandemic. There was something that made them feel a greater sense of control. And now you're saying you want to take it away. Like that's a hard path to follow.
Nigel?
Yeah, I would agree with everything. I mean, I would add that Paula mentioned. I'd add a couple of perspectives. I would stay away from the the why, because they're smarter people than me that can articulate the pressure that women and other marginalized groups faced coming out of the pandemic and through the pandemic. What I would say as an employer, though, is we struggle with, I'll go back to being an actuary and the pure math. Like in our industry, depending on the statistic, every organization is a little different, but the workforce is probably skews 55 to 60% women in the FI space. You start adding in BIPOC or people of color, and you're probably into like that's 70% of your workforce, 70% plus. And so I think a lot of the challenges we see is that the constructs in the workplace were not built in mind with that significant, the majority of the workforce. And now we're faced with this, whether it's an evolution or a revolution, to rethink that. So for sure, what we hear a lot, I think one of the beautiful arcs that we see in diversity is a subtle movement from treating people the way you want to be treated to treating people the way they want to be treated, right? And I think we have this gap with a lot of organizations where we project what has historically worked to advance in the organization. Now, I'm not naive. That doesn't mean that I'm aware of proximity bias, and we don't have the answer yet, and these are issues we need to grapple. But at its heart, I feel we grapple with the paradigm shift of like what used to work and what will work in an ever-changing workforce. And we've talked about women for that group. I think the other group we talk about is people of color and Canada had 1 million immigrants last year, and we're going to continue to have first-generation Canadians in the workplace. And they live further from the workplace, and they have different cultural expectations. And how do we all know we're in a war for talent. So it's the employers that are the fastest to evolve that I think will do best. And right now, I think there's still a bit of a haze of like, hey, the last 2 years were a blip. Let's just get back to the way things were and the way that they've always worked. And while I don't have the answer, I don't think that is the answer.
Yeah, and one thing that I'd sort of just add to that as well. I mean, there's this debate, and you can argue back and forth around whether, you should have an in-office policy or a work-from-home policy or an in-between policy and all the rest of that. And I'd ask organizations just to think about what's going to help their workforce work at their best. So that's it. But the other thing I would ask is for us to really think carefully about both models, because I don't think we have it completely right either way. So, what we have found, and there's been some research by an organization called Catalyst and others that says that, sometimes when we have this communication that is through video conferencing, we don't do it always in a way that's necessarily equitable by default. We sort of think it's equitable because all the little squares are the same size, but it's not. The experience of women consistently has been that if it's a large meeting in particular, that they feel less comfortable, less open to speak up, less invited to speak. So there's things that happen in terms of this work from home that are not always great. We have to get it better. We have to make sure that people have a sense of belonging, because sometimes it declines. We have to make sure that this new way of work actually does work. And same in the office. None of those problems just go away just because you put people in the same space. I mean, think of a prison yard. You're putting people in the same space, but they don't want to be there. They're not going to be very culturally collaborative. You have to make sure that if you do have an in-office culture or any combination of that we take this opportunity to say, really, what culture do we want? How are we building the way that we're interacting each other that sets a norm that is healthy, that is productive, that addresses the fact that 10% of people don't want to return, not because of commute and time, which is the majority, but 10% don't want to return because of toxicity in the workplace.
2 quick points, Paula. I love what your point about sort of Zoom and virtual meetings and videos. I'd say applies to women. It also applies to introverts versus extroverts. English as a first language. So those are tools, like whether you're in office or hybrid, we're not going away from video meetings, right? So I think there's a whole generation of leaders that we have to educate on how do you engage others, how do you bring them along the journey, how do you solicit opinions and all that. I think the other point that the question that one of the attendees asked, Keith, is a good one. I always think we get into these very theoretical, and it isn't one size fits all. So we talk about the workplace. I think there's some truisms. If I look at my call center, the KPIs were actually the same or better throughout COVID. I don't see any reason to force a person in a call center who's on calls all day to come into the office to take those calls. I think a lot of back office roles are perfectly fine operating remotely. Do I think we have more productive leadership team meetings when we're all in the same room? I absolutely do. Not always, and we have to mix it up. Do I think it's different for frontline sales? So I do think we sometimes struggle with these identity questions of like one size fits all, and I don't think there's a clear answer. And I think it's back to really putting in the work to establish guidelines, policies in a way that makes sense versus just sort of trying to find a one size fits all solution. 3 days, even if you say 3 days in the office, which 3 days is everyone in on the same 3 days? Are my teams in on the same 3 days? Right? Like, I think that's these are complex issues. It depends on the problem you're trying to solve.
I want to just jump in on another topic now. This is something that when we met to prepare for this webinar, we briefly touched on, and I thought it would be important to raise today as well. And that's about financial health and mental health. So we're looking, post-pandemic, what has the pandemic left us with? Well, it's left us with massive government debt, an inflationary problem that the central banks across the world are trying to tackle with higher interest rates, which is resulting in people who borrow having an increased cost for borrowing, and will also probably result in a recession in Canada and in other developed economies. And recessions pretty well always are associated with higher unemployment and higher uncertainty for those who sell their labor. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of stress. And I'm reminded as well, Nigel and Paula, of a survey I recently read, which I thought was just extraordinary, that a majority of Canadians live paycheck to paycheck, that even a few $100s additional expense that was unanticipated could knock them off their plan, all of which is, of course, very stressful. And so when we look at all that uncertainty and all of that stress, can you comment on strategies for dealing with that and what employers potentially can do to help in that sort of environment? Paula, let me start with you.
Yeah, so to amplify what you said, just today, actually, we launched the TELUS Health Mental Health Index, and this was a deep dive version on financial well-being and the relationship between financial and mental well-being. So to the point, we actually had a 2-point decline in the mental health of working Canadians between last month and this month. That's absolutely massive. That is huge in 1 month. So after we'd kind of gotten to a point of stabilizing much below where we were in 2019, we have this decline. And lo and behold, we have a 3-point decline in financial well-being. 41% of working Canadians are feeling overwhelmed by debt. So this locks your mind. You can't be at your best when you aren't in a good financial situation. But employers can help. I mean, and it's not just about increasing salary. The things that are making the difference in the perception of employees as well as their scores are forced savings plans, so automatic savings plans, because we found that the correlation between having emergency savings and people's mental well-being, having that cushion was actually the aspect of financial well-being that made the biggest difference in terms of mental health, mental well-being, and productivity. There are education sessions as well, but the problem is a lot of people don't actually avail themselves of it. So some people are feeling embarrassed about the fact that they even need to be educated. So we have to think of digital means where in real time, we're giving people, without necessarily being asked, ongoing information that'll help support their financial well-being. But really that path, that automatic path, through the automatic savings program came out well and above on top in terms of the value.
Thank you, Paula. Nigel?
Yeah, well, listening to you frame the question, Keith, brilliantly as you often do. I think one kind of cautionary lesson I would say is I think we sometimes talk about COVID in the last couple of years interchangeably with the period of COVID. And the thing, and what happened, to your point, is while we had COVID, we attribute a lot of stuff to COVID, but we also had rising inflation, and there's a relationship there and more focus on social injustice and all that. So a lot has happened in the last few years. I think it's well established that financial stress is one of the biggest contributors to mental health and well-being. And so building on Paula's point, I think both certainly in our field, in terms of our products to our people, there's things we can do to grant peace of mind around financial security in a period of rising debt loads. I think it does take some creativity with employees. So for example, one of the things we did last year is implemented a $150 amount work style allowance, because we heard a lot from our employees of like, hey, gas prices are going up, parking is going up, or I'm working from home, now I have my internet. And I think getting to the earlier question, it was hard to come up with a policy for everyone. If you were working from home, if you were taking transit, if you were parking. And so we said, hey, we recognize rising costs. Let's do something to help our people, at least one aspect of their budget, alleviate it, right? So I think there's things you can do as an employer. I agree with the forced savings. I agree with the means to manage cost, but it is a complex question, and financial health and well-being or financial stress definitely contributes to mental health.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
I want to say something controversial as well. It's not controversial, it's just the data. I'm just the messenger. But in this time where we're also short on talent, it was 36%. It was definitely over 35, but 36% of people said that they would leave their current employer for another employer that had a defined benefits pension. So, and interestingly enough, there was not as much variation in terms of age as one would think. The variation was more likely those people who had their own financial savings and financial advisors, and they basically had a lot of control, which was not necessarily everyone, but that defined pension benefit is still there as something valuable to employees.
That's very interesting. You've been a just fantastic panel. Both of you have been so insightful. The hour has just whipped by. We're at the end of our webinar. I'm just going to turn to each of you just for your final thoughts. Let me start with you, Nigel, and then the last word to you, Paula. Nigel?
Well, firstly, again, thank you again for inviting me and for sharing the stage with Paula. I think my final word is a continuation of my arc and my theme, which is, I do think the time is now as employers to revisit the impact we can have on our employees' health and mental health and well-being. I realize we can't do everything, but there is a lot we control around the workplace environment, flexible work arrangements, financial well-being, time off, etc. So my final word is that I think as employers, we have an opportunity to do more, but it does take some creativity and sometimes some courage to go against the trend.
Paula.
Yeah, and I will say for myself, and I might even take a leap and also speak for Nigel, the reason why we want to bring this information to you is because we want Canadian employers to do better. And better for many reasons. Not only is it good for people and their quality of life, but it's essential for our future, our economic future. When you really look at the difference between organizations that are strong and are going to be stronger in the future and those that will languish, it is organizations who invest in their people. It's a people-powered economy like we've never seen before, and not just about preventing disability. We need people to be at the top of their game. So having policies, practices, investments, and strategies that help people be at the top of their game is the only way that the organization is going to be at the top of theirs.
All right, very wise words of wisdom to end this webinar from both of you. Thank you both again on behalf of CAFII and all the attendees today. And thank you to the attendees for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen to these very important insights on mental health issues in the workplace. On behalf of CAFII, I want to thank you all, and I want to wish everyone a great rest of your day. Thank you and good afternoon.